Hey everybody, since you've been put online, we are covering some of the materials for the semester without meeting face to face. The first one of those units is the families on the home front during World War II. So this would have been in the 1940s, immediately following the Great Depression. So these lectures will be very short, but they're going to kind of help go through the PowerPoints and drive home the important material. So if you're actually reading the book, it begins with a story about Frankie Cooper and how even though she was never in the military or in an area where they were actually fighting, she had a lot of things going on in her life because of the impact of World War II. So we'll talk about some of those things that were going on for families on the home front. So we started entering the war during 1941, and then we actually dropped a bomb on Japan, making them surrender in 1945. So 41 and 45 are going to be a really influential dates that you should know for major events impacting the U.S. during World War II. Here's some famous images. Women were supposed to ration their food. There was food booklets. I'll show you those in just a second. So some of the most important things to keep track of is that there was a draft for military men to go over to war. This left behind a lot of women alone or women here raising their children. We had a huge population growth during this time because a lot of times before men were shipped off to war, they would get married and a lot of pregnancies occurred during this time too. So some people would get married with barely knowing each other. There's stories of people who had met and got married the next day. Some people were truly in love. Some were looking for benefits to be married to a soldier. Some men just wanted to have someone back home to write to. So it really just depends. This caused an extreme growth in the economy. The getting out of the Great Depression, which lasted, as you know, the entire decade of the 30s, is really attributed to the fact that we did enter World War II. We also had a lot of migration. Families that were on the home front were moving across the United States quite a bit. So there was a shortage in housing and there was an overcrowding. It was also very hard to find childcare for your children. A lot of teenagers were expected to stay home and take care of their siblings having to leave school. Women were having to join the workforce doing jobs that men had primarily done. This is the whole Rosie the Riveter era. And then men, of course, were across fighting in the war. This is also, we know that the Great Depression brought a lot of government programs to help families. And the 60s also, we've continued to see government programs. I'm sorry, the 60s. I meant to say the 40s. There's even more of them coming out in the 60s. Sorry, guys. So this is an image of women actually working within the factories. Some of the materials that would have normally have been made that were not going towards war production were actually halted. Record players, for example, there was a year that a certain Model T from the Ford company was not made. We did make more wages, however, the government did take away more in taxes, and we also had more people working and paying tax. So this did help the economy. This also caused an increase in prices and inflation in general. So as I said, people were actually having to ration their food. Women were, deemed the general of the kitchen, basically. What you're seeing is an advertisement in the newspaper for actually what dates you could come and get which items. And then the picture at the bottom right there is going to be the actual stamps where you would go with your ration book and be able to cash in to get the items that were available during that time. So this is the movie I was going to show you in class if our whole semester hadn't gotten completely screwed up. Again, I encourage you to watch it on your own. It's really good. It looks at teenagers in the United States, England, and Germany throughout World War I and World War II. It's super cool. Anyway, but there was a concern because kids were starting to be left alone. Teenagers were having to have more responsibility. They weren't really prepared emotionally to do things like that or maturity-wise. A lot of moving around. A lot of changes in the home front in general, and a lot of juvenile delinquency coming out during this time. Teenagerism was still pretty new. Remember, we didn't have child labor laws until the 30s, so the 40s it was all pretty new of kids, 10 years old, 12 years old, not having to be at work. So we did have to lessen some of those child labor laws that we had enacted in order to get certain ages back in the workforce to help bring in income for the family. Because dads were gone and moms were at work, we also saw a decline in parental authority, which did lead to more premarital sex, sexually transmitted diseases / infections, and then also a rise in premarital pregnancy. So the picture you see at the bottom right is the Rosie the Riveter poster that's been mass reproduced. I'm sure you've all seen that. The picture at the top is actually the original Rosie the Riveter. It was a Norman Rockwell painting, except it was too expensive to mass produce and copyright and stuff, so they made a different one. So as you can see, statistically, we started to see a lot more women while we were in the war going into work. The largest growth, this is important, actually took place in the aircraft industry. 65% of the workers were actually women working in aircraft industry during that time. You should definitely click this link and look at the history of Rosie the Riveter. It's pretty cool. And this is one of those famous pictures that we've talked about before. This is when the military man arrived home. It was Victory over Japan Day, VJ Day, which was 1945, and he grabbed a random nurse on the street and kissed her. Extremely famous photograph celebrating the end of the war. However, now it's been under scrutiny because he didn't have consent to get this kiss. So like we talked about in class, a lot of extremely famous images come out of different time periods. So what happened after people were coming home? Well, there was a lot of divorce. This was one because people were cheating while they were apart. Infidelity was a pretty new thing, but it was happening quite a bit while the men were off to war and while the women were home. A large amount of divorces came from people getting married too quickly. They didn't know each other at all, being separated for years and years and years at a time, and also having your entire relationship be through letter writing, and then actually having to be in the same place can be very bad or very difficult. You need to remember too that while the men were away, women had to step up and do things and be a lot more self-sufficient. So it was very hard for some people to step back and not have those roles anymore. It was also hard for men to adjust to women being more self-sufficient. So all of those things led to issues within the marriages. This was also the time that latchkey children became a thing. So this would be when kids would come home from school alone and have a key to the house and stay there by themselves for a few hours. In our society, that was really normal for kids to get off the bus, when they're 10 years old, be home for a couple hours alone after school. But prior to World War II, it really wasn't something that kids were doing in the United States because dad was at work and mom was at home. If you were someone who waited to get married and had larger families, then for the most part you were pretty successful during this time period. However, you were not the most successful in American history. We continued to have a housing shortage after the war. A lot of people moved out to the suburbs. We'll see more about that in the 1950s lecture about Levittown and the first actual suburbs and communities like that. And then we also, during World War II, did put Japanese Americans in containment camps. So when the war ended, we did allow them to exit those decontainment camps. Thought that was it. Okay, like I said, these are pretty short and sweet, guys. So you can move on to the 1950s.